Hello? Can you guys... Okay, I think I have audio now. Let me know if you guys can hear me. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. My bad, guys. Okay, so let's start over. My fault entirely. Okay, so as you guys can see, I have this comp here that is 1920 by 1080, right? And what I might want to do is I might just want to save this guy out to a single frame, right? So this is just a standard comp, 1920 by 1080. If we check the render settings here, or the comp settings, right, with 1920 height 1080. So the way that you save out a frame in After Effects, right, is you come to Composition, Save Frame As, and File. And then it gives you a Photoshop document, tells you where to output it. I'm gonna save it to this, overwrite it because I just wrote that one a moment ago, and I'm gonna hit render. It'll happen instantaneously, right? And I'm gonna come back here and I'm gonna import that guy back again. Click OK, and what you'll notice is that this image is not 1920 1080, right? This image is half size, and if we look up here, we can actually see that it is 960 by 540, right? And so let's try and figure out what is making that happen, and the answer is actually really frustrating about why After Effects does this. And the other thing, okay, sorry, moving around. So when we add a still to a render sequence, right? So I'm going to come back here again, Composition, Save Frame As File. Brings it here. What you'll notice is that we have our options for our Photoshop document. If you wanted to change it to like a JPEG or something, you have that here as well. You got your output, but you also have this thing that's called render settings up here. And this part about render settings is that it says current settings, right? And what you might be used to seeing here is best settings, right? And for some reason, After Effects sets the default frame output to current settings, right? And what current settings means, most importantly, I'm trying to see if we can see it here, is you can actually see size 1920 1080 960 540, and that's because I have this comp set to half res right here. If I put this down to quarter res, for instance, and I come to current settings, you'll see that that's now 480 by 270, right? So when you use current settings, that actually is just going to like take all of the settings of your viewer, including this resolution here, and kick that out to the frame. So there's a couple different ways to fix that, right? The easiest one is just to change this to best settings here. I'll render this guy, bring it back in, and you'll see up here, yeah, 1920 1080, perfectly fine, right? So it's just changing that thing to best settings. What I would actually recommend that you guys do is you come up here to Edit, to Templates, and then to Render Settings, and if you change here the frame default from current settings to best settings, that way when I add this to my render queue, or sorry, go to Save Frame As, now it's just going to automatically set it up as best settings there, right? So now in the future, you set that once and you should never have to worry about it doing its thing, like that irritating current size thing. Again, right? And you can, and while we're on that, right, you can use this templates to be like, I always want my templates output module, I always want my frame default to be a TIFF, right, instead of a PSD, right? Or what I can do is I can make a new setting and I can make this into a JPEG, click OK, say JPEG here, and then this way I can say all my new frames are going to be JPEGs, right? So you can use this template both for the output modules, these guys here, and for the render settings, so you can set up how these things behave automatically. And I glossed over it really quickly, but you saw that there's all kinds of other stuff here for pre-renders, proxies, save current previews, etc., etc., etc. So play around with that and make sure that you set up your presets the way that you like them. But yeah, that current settings is probably what's getting you. Okay, so now we're gonna look at how to make this map thing animate, and I'm just going to see if I can Google a vector map really quick so that we have something to work with. Excuse me just a minute here. USA. There's a bunch of maps of states, but not of Sorry. Trying to find a map. Okay, got it. Nice. 5, 4, 3, 2. Got it. Okay, so we have this map that I'm going to bring in here, right? And I'll make my new comp. And I'll drag this map in, right? And so now what I'm going to do is I basically need to find a way to convert this guy from this Illustrator document, which is there, into a shape that I can play with in After Effects, right? And the way that you do that is you right click here, you come to create, and you say create shapes from vector layer. It'll take a minute, but basically what it's going to do is it's going to go in there and split out every single little bit of this vector that I've got, and it's going to put it on a bunch of different shapes, right? So that inherently becomes really useful when you're just trying to work with illustrators. If you need to get access to the actual vectors, you can do it that way. But I'm noticing in this one that let's just do a state or something like that, right? Because I don't think that we need to do all of this, right? So I'm just gonna delete all except for, which lucky state is it? Idaho. Right, so we're just going to do this state. And so I'm going to center this guy up. And then, okay, so here's where we need to start talking about what these shape layers do and why they're important, right? And I think that this is going to get a little bit technical, so bear with me, but... okay. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. If I ignore the fact that this is a shape layer, right? If I ignore the fact that if this is just a regular old image layer, I click on it, right? I have properties like anchor point, position, scale, rotation, right? And we can see here that my anchor point for this layer is right here, and my layer itself is right here, right? So what happens when I scale this layer is it scales about the anchor point, right? It scales, excuse me, you don't need to see my emails. It scales using the anchor point as its point of origin, right? And that makes sense, right? We're used to seeing that in all kinds of programs, right? Anchor points are very familiar to us, right? But the problem with shape layers is that we have a bunch of anchor points, right? So when I come into this Idaho comp, now I have an anchor point here as well, right? And what you'll notice is if I now try and scale this guy, it's going to scale from the middle, right? Even though the anchor point of the layer is right here, right? And you can kind of see if I zoom in here that I've got this little anchor here that's going to make that scaling happen around the center, right? Like that. But I can actually move this anchor point too, right? I can totally just like say I want it to scale from the bottom right. I can now move this anchor point, or excuse me, the bottom left. I can move it down here. And now when I scale this guy, right, it's going to scale around that bottom corner, as you would expect. But the other thing too is now I can also scale this layer on a layer level from its actual own anchor point too, right? So I can move this anchor point around so that my anchor point is right here, and I'm going to scale this guy right here, you know, around that anchor point. You can see maybe it's easier to see from rotation, right? It's going to rotate around that anchor point. But then when I come here and I scale the layer on this level, it's actually going to scale around this anchor point, right? And so the point of this being is that shape layers have a bunch of internal anchor points that happen that you need to kind of manage to make sure that when you copy and paste things, when you move things between groups, when you do whatever, that it's going to behave, right? And so what I would suggest for everybody is try not to animate your shape layer properties down here in the transforms, right? In these guys down here. You basically don't want to move the entire shape layer around, right? You basically want to keep the shape layer right in the center, right where it comes in by default, and then move the different components of that shape layer individually, right? And so let's center this guy back up, right? The default anchor point is going to be 960 by, no, it's going to be 00. I don't even remember. So how it's an easy way to figure that out is I'll just right click and I'll say new shape layer, and I'll see what this anchor point comes in as, right? 00960 by 540. So I will come back to this layer, 00960 by 540. And what you'll see, again, remember, I can still move this thing around, right? This whole layer, even though I'm moving this shape, the transform Idaho here, I'm not actually moving the layer. The layer is still in the exact center, right? And so what might I want to do here inside this Idaho comp is I might actually also want to center this guy up so that I'm using it the best way that I can, right? And so I'll zero everything out so that my anchor point is directly in the center here. So now I have a layer, right? If I click on my layer has an anchor point in the center, and also my shape group called Idaho also has an anchor in the center, so everything is behaving as it should be. Everything's zeroed out. If I make a new shape inside this group, it gets made right at the beginning, right at the center of the screen and everything. But as you can see, this is a really good example of what's happening, right? Is this square is turned, right? And that's because I have this rotation left in this group, right? So when I make a new square and it's put inside of this Idaho group, it automatically inherits the rotation of the group as a whole, right? And so that's basically the most important thing to remember, is that when I have these transforms here, when I have this rotation property, no matter what I add to this state, to this group, it's gonna come in with a -6 rotation, right? So let's say I can add a star, right? That's gonna do the same thing. You'll see that it's tilted, right? Whereas if I was to center it back up, it would be perfectly straight. And so that's essentially the problem with shape layers comes down to that, is managing your transforms and where things are, right? So the situation I have now, a couple of different things I can do. So here's a really good example, is I want to scale this Idaho up, right? I want this Idaho to be bigger, and I could just come into this transform Idaho and crank it, right, and scale it, and that's going to be no problem. But then guess what happens? The moment I add a star to this guy, it's going to be huge, right? Like, because again, I'm being blown up 7.5 times by the default, right? Even though my radius here is only supposed to be 100 pixels, it's actually being blown up 700%. So that's why it looks so big, right? So I don't actually want to scale up the group as a whole, right? I want to leave that at 100%, and then I'm just going to come to this path, and I'm going to hit Command T and just scale the path up, right? So that's going to let me scale the path around the center without changing any of my transform properties, right? So now my scale's at 100%. If I were to come in here and create a star again, now you'll see that star is small and in the center, right? This just makes everything behave a little bit better, because now I know that this is 100. If I change this, that's exactly what I'm getting. There's no additional scaling that's happening on top of it, so on and so forth, right? So now we want to talk about how to make shapes interact with one another, right? And so I'm going to call this state outline, right? State outline path, actually. And then I'm going to demonstrate here how to use some of those Pathfinder tools, right? So if I, as we were looking before, if I make an ellipse and I make this ellipse a little bit bigger, again, using the size property of the ellipse, not the property of the group, and then moving the ellipse over this way, again, not moving the whole group, which is going to move both things together, is by default, you get this kind of like inversion happening, right? So where my circle intersects with the state, I get alpha, and where it doesn't, I get opacity, right? I get opaqueness there. And so that's the default behavior when you have overlapping paths in After Effects, which is just the same as you would get in Illustrator, right? But we can use that merge paths thing here to control how those paths merge, right? And so here you'll see that if I turn that off again, we have this intersection, but when I turn the merge paths on add mode, it basically merges those two paths together. The same thing I can do is subtract, right? I can use this ellipse right here. Let me turn my edges back on. I can use this ellipse to cut out my circle, right? I can do the opposite. I can do intersect, right? So it's only where they overlap in the middle. And then you have exclude intersections, which is basically the default behavior, right? And what you'll notice here as well is this is also going to affect how my fills and strokes are applied, right? So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add just a regular old stroke to this layer. I'm going to hide my edges, and you'll see that by default, both shapes get a stroke on them, right? Whereas if I can come in here and I turn on this merge path to something like merge, or excuse me, add, not merge, you'll see that those two things become one larger path now. So After Effects understands this whole thing as one path. And as I play with, for instance, like the stroke weight, right, you can see that that stroke weight is going to affect the entire shape, including, affect the entire shape as if it was one shape, whereas if I had turned off this merge path and I scale it, the stroke width here, you'll see that it scales. You have all of this stuff in here that shouldn't actually be there. Well, it could be. It depends on what you're going for, right? But understanding how your shapes are being merged, your shapes are being grouped, and your shapes are being stacked is key to not going crazy with these shape layers, right? And so we'll add my fill back on, and maybe what we'll do to start is just like a really simple transition, right? Where I'll take this circle and I'll put it 0, 0, which is right in the center, and I'll start the scale of this circle at 0, and then I'll come forward a couple frames and I'll blow it up so it's big, right? I'll ease these keyframes. Do something like that, and then I'll get this animation right where I have this kind of scaling up that's going on. But maybe I don't want those things to behave with this kind of weird inversion. Maybe I want them to basically just have the circle mask out the shape. And how I would do that, right, is I would turn this mode to intersect, because I basically only want to show the state where the circle is. And this will be easier if you look at these edges here, right? So where there's overlap, or intersection rather, between the state and the circle, I get my fill applied, whereas where there's no overlap, there's not. And so now as I animate this, right, you'll see this kind of scale up, and it's kind of doing the fill in like that, right? So that's pretty easy just with a circle. I can use that. I can use different shapes, squares, anything like that, in order to make this animation work like that. And just with Pathfinder, it's very simple and very straightforward to do that sort of thing, right? And again, now I can take this whole animation, right, which is my scale up animation, and I could, for instance, now transform the entire group over here and make it a little bit smaller. And now you can see that animation happens, and I've just totally repurposed it and moved it over without actually changing where the layer is or changing any of the individual paths, right? So that's the real power of shape layers, is how it allows you to group these things and play with them. The other thing that I want to show you guys really quickly is just some of the other stuff we have with shape layers. And one of those is going to be, if I delete this fill and I'm going to add my stroke back, one of them is going to be this offset paths, right, which is the same function that we have in Illustrator. But what's nice about this is that it basically, if I show my edges, go to my path so we can see it, right, that's my path. I can basically just take this guy and push my stroke away or towards the center of it, right? And you'll see that this is doing some cool stuff in that we get a more maybe organic fill-in as opposed to the circle that we had before that had a really kind of defined shape. So I'm going to take my stroke out, I'm going to add my fill, and you'll see that the same thing works, right? As I animate this path, I can fill in my shape that way, right? And so what I might do is come here, and I might say that I don't want to offset my path at all at the end, right? And then I'll come back to my beginning and I'll just crank this down until it all goes away. Come back here, ease my keyframes. And now I'll get a little bit more of an organic kind of swell, right? Where this whole thing kind of fills in from the middle. And, you know, not to mention that there's no reason that we couldn't combine these things, right? Where I could take, right, just, I mean, this is going to look weird, but just for the sake of demonstrating it, right, I can come here and actually I should show you guys something while we're looking at this. Notice that this outline pass or offset pass applies to this star as well, and that's, again, it's because it's in the same group, right? So this offset pass is affecting everything in this group. What if I don't want it to affect everything in the group? What if I only want it to affect my state outline? And the way to do that is you just put the star below the offset paths, right? So now if I hide this guy, you'll see that now my star isn't doing anything, right? Because essentially the order goes top to bottom, so the offset is happening before the star is calculated, and therefore the star doesn't get animated or moved at all, right? But now I can start to layer these things, and now I can add, for instance, like a merge pass, right? It added a bunch of stuff that I didn't want, and so now I can merge, for instance, let's do intersect, right? And so now what you'll see is that I get both the growing shape and the star, right? And so I can take my star now, I can make it a little bit bigger this way, but you can see still that now I've been able to layer both of these things together, right? I have this shape that's masking it in the star using the merge pass, but I also have stacked this offset path before the star in order to create this kind of more organic fill-in motion, right? And so that's hopefully the quickest. How would I don't know, stretching scaling? Okay, so there's a question in the YouTube chat. How would you add Oregon and Washington State along with Idaho, i.e. by stretching scaling, thus creating 3 states? And so how I would probably do that is you saw up in here, right, where we, when I converted this over to shapes from my vector layer, it actually took each of those states and put them in their own group, right? And so this is an opportunity where I think that using the groups is a really good way to manage situations like this where you have multiple things, right? So if I wanted to find Washington, I'm just going to turn all of these off until I find Washington. I wish there was like an easier way to do this, but Joop joop. There's so many of them. Turn off a bunch, see if I can find it. And ideally you'll have layered all of these things in Illustrator and you'll name them and they won't just be group infinity, but we'll see. Maybe it's going from the bottom. Why are there's a lot of them? Go up from the bottom. Okay, we're starting to get there. You can see that the states are disappearing one by one. And so now this is another really good example of what I'm going to try and basically come back here and steal this shape from this layer and use it on my new one. So I'm trying again just to isolate where that Washington State is. It would be the literal last one. Okay, it's one of those guys. That one. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this group. And I'm going to come back here and I'm going to delete this whole mess of a layer, right? Because I don't need it anymore. And I'm going to come here and I'm going to paste my other group, right? And just for the sake of understanding things easily, I'm going to first move my fill inside my Idaho group because that's only filling Idaho. And I'm going to turn Idaho off. And you'll see here that I have this little itty bitty Washington State down here, right? So then what I might do, right, is I'm going to essentially do the same thing that I did before, is I'm going to first zero out my shape, right, because I don't necessarily, I want my shape group to have the shape at the center of it, right? I don't want to necessarily turn the Idaho off so you can see. I want to be able to have this scale around the center standard goodness, right, that I've got going on here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially turn my Idaho back on, and then I'm going to find my path for Washington. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing that I did with Idaho where I scale this path up, right? So I'll come back here, I'll zoom in a little bit, I'll click on this path, and then I'll hit Command, click on the path, then hit Command T. What is going on? Path, Command T, Command T. For some reason, it's not letting me select. There we go. I have to be on the move tool. Move tool, hit the path, then Command T. It brings out this bounding box that I can use to basically scale up this state to be approximately the size of Idaho. Right now, I have a decision to make. Do I want to move the whole path, or do I want to move the group, right? And I'm going to choose here to move the group because I want to keep that in the center, right? And this is not how big Washington is, right? I think it's more like, come on, David. V, click on this. Click here, Command T. I'm really struggling with this for some reason. There we go. I think it's more like about that, right? It's just kind of this half. And so what I'm actually going to do now is, because I want to be able to scale this whole state from the center, I'm going to move the whole group over here, right? So I'll move Washington like that, and I'll move it up the thing, and I'll move it over. And obviously I'm not doing this very precisely because I would have done this all at the same time, right, with the states already positioned next to each other as I had in here, rather than trying to line them up manually. But essentially this is what I would do. My first step of cleaning up my shape layer would be to go through each of these states, take out any additional transformations that I have, and line everything up so that I have these nice center points that behave well in each of my states, right? So now I can animate Washington by itself here, and I can animate Idaho by itself here, right? And they're totally unrelated. But what I can do too is I can take some of this stuff that I've already done. I can get rid of that merge path we're not using. I can take this offset path and, for instance, just copy it and paste it down into the Oregon, and then you can see that my key's pasted over here, but I can do something like this where I offset them, and now I'm going to get this kind of two-state animation that's happening like that, right? This is really bugging me that this is not... And so, see, this is the benefit of using shape layers too, is I'm able to come in here and play with the shape without worrying about any of the animation, right? All of this animation still works totally as is, not a problem, which is really nice, because now I've just created this really easy staggered animation of I would say Canada if I didn't know any better, but but of these two different states, right, that behave that way. And now they're totally modular. They're totally in their own group inside of here. They have their own fills. Noticed again that this one is white and this one is red. I don't even have to have a fill here if I don't want. I can come and I can add a stroke so that Washington has a stroke, whereas Idaho has the fill, right? So these two things work together really well. And then the other thing that I can do on top of this now is I can actually make empty groups in my shape layer, right? So I might call this whatever, Pac NW, right, for the Pacific Northwest, and I can take both of these shapes and put them inside this Pacific Northwest thing. So now I have actually a group that can animate the whole thing together, right? Now it animates both of these, and I can scale them down, and my animation will still transfer, right? Where I've got this this animation happening, and all of this stuff is still zeroed out, right? It's still, I've moved Washington, right? But my anchor points are still at 0, 0. My scales are still at 100. Everything is modular and kind of like kept in its own little thing, and I can just move the whole system using this Pac NW group that I've made here, right? And so I can use this kind of nesting in shape layers is what makes them so powerful. I think that the biggest gotcha with the shape layers is like not going through and cleaning up your layers once you've made them, especially from Illustrator files, because they don't actually come in always the way that you want them to, right? Sometimes there's a bunch of extra merge paths that you don't need. Sometimes there's a bunch of centering that's weird and wrong. And so I would recommend that if you realize you're trying to scale something but it's scaling from like totally the wrong part of the composition, go in there and check your anchor points and make sure that everything is lining up the way that it should. The other thing that I'll point you guys to is this script. It's called Explode Shape Layers. Sorry, I want to make sure you guys can see it. Explode Shape Layers up here. And basically what this does is you guys can look at the different things, but it's a really good way to be like, okay, now that I have this thing and I want to have Idaho and Washington on their own layers, right? Explode Shape Layers will do that, whereas we'll split out the sub shapes into their own layers, and then vice versa. You could say I have a bunch of shapes on a bunch of different layers and I want to put them together. I use this script like on a weekly, if not daily basis. Like, it's really, really powerful. If you need a copy of it, maybe hit me up and I might be able to help you and point you in the right direction. But it's definitely worth buying if you plan on using the shape layers often, right? And so that's basically, hopefully that covers a lot of the shape layer confusion. I think that they are a bit tricky to understand in general, and you just have to really like just work with them over and over and over again until you can kind of figure out, okay, I need to keep my anchor points where they should be. I need to keep everything zeroed out. I need to keep all of this in a way that is as modular as possible, right? So I'm going to save this so that we've got it. I'm going to delete that out. We don't need it. Blah, blah, blah. It's July now. And then the one thing I want to talk about really quickly before we end, and I'm sorry that I don't have more time to talk about this because it is really a huge topic inside of After Effects that that really needs a lot of time. I'll see if I can find some tutorials about this, but essentially how to speed up After Effects. And there's a couple of different things that you can do to speed up After Effects, right? The first and the most obvious is just to change your resolution right here, right? Full means that even though I'm only viewing this composition at 25%, I'm still rendering every single pixel that happens, right? So I'm rendering pixels I don't even see because I'm zoomed out. Whereas, you know, if I go to half, I only render every other and third, quarter, so on and so forth. What I would recommend doing most of the time is leaving this guy on auto, right? And what auto basically does is it says, show me all of the pixels that I can see, right? So you'll notice that I'm at 25% and I get quarter. The same thing happens here. If I go to 50%, I'll get half, right? So this is basically, by leaving it on auto, you're saying, show me the pixels that I can see and don't waste processing power on those that I can't. But alternatively, if you are looking at this at a full res 100 and you need it to go faster, you can drop this down to third or to quarter or to half or whatever, and it should speed up a little bit. You'll see that these edges get janky because it's just basically like low res previewing, right? So you can turn that down to make your After Effects speed up a little bit. The other thing that I'll point you to really quickly is you see here that I have under here, I have this use display color management. You might not have this if you haven't defined a color space for your project, but this is a huge processor hog. So you can sometimes when you need to play something back, you can turn that off so that it plays back at the right rate, but then you always do want to leave it on so that you can see your true colors. This is a bigger thing that we can talk about more, but oftentimes playback issues can be related to that guy being on. And then the final thing is this little lightning bolt over here, which are these basically your fast preview, adaptive preview options, right? And so if by on default it's on off, which means final quality, which means that when I move things, when I do stuff, just like basically update in real time, right? Like move the shape, let me see what it looks like as it's moving, so on and so forth. Whereas if you change to some of the other options like adaptive resolution, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but essentially what will happen is it'll drop the resolution of the shape while you're dragging it, so you get a faster mouse response, right? And then it'll like zap back to its full res when you drop it. And then finally, I'm going to put this back in the center. Finally, you can put this onto either fast draft, which is just going to give you an even faster version. You can see that my edges are getting really janky, but look how fast this guy works. And then finally, the wireframe just straight takes out all of the color, and if you put the edges on, you can just see basically the bounding boxes. So this one isn't that helpful, unfortunately. I would say either leave this on off if you can, or adaptive resolution if you need a little bit of speed going through, and then make sure you're just managing your resolution over here when you can. And okay, so I think that I'm sorry that was a little bit short. We did go a little bit long in the class tonight. I hope everyone is feeling okay about their projects. I'm really happy with the work that everyone is doing. Please, again, hit me up in the week if you have any questions. I'm gonna go ahead right now and drop this while I'm sitting here with you. Drop the project file that we just made with these shapes into the Dropbox if you guys would like to check it out. I'm gonna put it in the recordings folder. So that if you guys want to look at that as a point of reference, you can. Thanks for hanging out, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your week. Thanks for being flexible with the 4th and joining us here on a Thursday. Hit me up with questions if you have anything. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have next week. Take it easy and have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.